hers is a life which really is like three-ply yarn.
Yes.
You can't separate the strands. If you separate the strands, you get only one part of her life. You don't get the complexity of the choices she made, not just in her personal life, but in her political engagement, and in the subjects she chose to write about. So that, to me, sort of, she personified a feminist project, if you like, apart, of course, from being one of the first modern writers in English.
Yes.
But I'm sure she has some more to add to that.
But what I would like to ask is, Nayantara, you know, the first 20 years of your life, so closely linked with the independence movement that was happening. What was it all about? Can you just give us a little jhalak of the enthusiasm, the patriotism that was taking place at that time? This whole movement that, you know, all of us tend to forget now as just one flag which is raised on the 15th of August, and that is it. You know, all of you were so in the thick of it all, and what was it all about?
Well, I can't say that I was in the thick of the independence movement because I was a child growing up. My parents were in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And of course, as a result of that and their commitment to the movement, they spent their lives in and out of jail, which was a very hard time for a child. But certainly, even a child was inspired by their commitment. They were driven by the star of freedom, and that no real normal life was possible until Indians could be free. So there was that aspect. But there were many trials of separation from the parents, of being different from other children, because we wore khadi. We had to observe certain rules, such as traveling in third-class compartments and not taking part in the sort of normal life of childhood otherwise. So it was a mixed kind of feeling about it.
But did you ever resent it, in the sense that, you know, as children, did you feel that, oh my God, why do my parents have to go to prison when everybody else is
as a child, I thought that that was the thing to do, and I used to wish I could grow up quickly so that I could go to jail too. I have to tell you, as Ritu has spoken about her biography, that I haven't read her biography, so I'm in no position to comment on anything she has said. But if she decided to make a book out of my literary and political life, okay. It's the personal that I have a problem with, because I think a great deal of personal emerges in a biography inevitably. And for a woman, that's always been a bit complicated. How much should be revealed, how much should not? That's one reason why I never wanted to write an autobiography.
But you've also said, you know, you had a basic resistance to the word feminist. You don't want to say that you are part of the feminist movement.
No.
Is it the humanist angle?
No. On the contrary, I never thought I was worthy of being called a feminist. Mm-hmm. I never thought that I had deserved that title. But Ritu has told me that I do.
I'm so glad that you're so obedient.
But Ritu, why was this feeling that, you know, Nayantara ji had, and then you must have kind of talked to her about it to explain to her what the feminism angle was? Was it part of the books? Was it part of her own life and her very, very different kind of existence that she had? And what was it that you know gave you the courage to tell her that no, she was a feminist?
You see, it all depends on how you how you define feminism. And maybe that was what, maybe that was the sort of distinction in the understanding with that Nayantara is talking about, and my take on it, if you like. I think every choice she made in her life, and it was, of course, her personal life, was a feminist choice. What does that mean? That means being responsible for the choices you make. It means exercising a certain autonomy at critical moments in your life. It means, how should I put it? A certain, she has said, and she has said this more than once, that she is concerned with relationships of power, whether it is between the governed and the government, between a state and citizen, between men and women. Now, what is that if not a feminist statement? How can you be concerned about relations of power and say that you are concerned about relations of power between men and women and not be feminist? You see, this is something, this is a realization that I do think feminism has brought before us, because otherwise all relations of power, all gender relations of power was seen to be given, that they were natural because we followed the biological explanation for it. Of course, feminism turned it on its head and said these are constructed identities. So in that sense, I think when you begin to see that, now, I'll just sort of respond to one of the things that Nayantara has said now about the political and the literary and the personal. There was, in my view, a decision that had to be made about how to relate her writing to her life. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? I wasn't actually interested in what Lytton Strachey has called a vulgar succession of events in someone's life. It was of no interest to me. To record a life from birth to, well, of course, in her case, not yet death, thank goodness, but from birth
chronologically,
onwards.
Yes.
Yes, I'm not interested in a chronological linear narrative, because that's not how we live our lives. We live our lives in a very different way. It's almost circular. You keep going forward, you keep going back. Then you move forward, you go back. These are concentric circles, which is why I decided, and I did discuss this with her, I decided I'm not going to begin with her birth. For two reasons. One, she had already written about her childhood in the autobiography. Yes. And two, the very critical decision to become a writer happened after she was married. Yes. Marriage was a critical turning point in Nayantara's life, like it or not. It's a critical turning point in most women's lives. It's a critical turning point in most women writers' lives. This I can say with some assurance, having worked with many, many writers, many women writers. Marriage and a domestic life are very, very difficult for women writers. And there are any number who cease to write once they enter that domestic space. She didn't. This was very important for me. And this is why I say that it was not possible to separate the personal from the personal life as she lived it from the books that she wrote. So how was I to arrive at the literary without also addressing the personal?
But as Ritu says that your writing career really took off after you were married, and was it some kind of a catharsis? Was it some kind of wanting to see all that was happening to you through the characters in your books? How do you explain this wanting to write about your life?
First of all, I never decided to write. It was not a decision. I just one day started writing.
Was it a compulsion?
No. I just wrote because I felt like it. And as I got on, I kept writing for the same reason, but I never thought of myself as a writer, as I have told Ritu. I also want to say that my life has not gone around in concentric circles, not at all. I've gone ahead.
No,
from one position to
but-
another.
Yes.
No.
But I meant as a writer, how does one approach a life? That's all I meant.
Okay, but in connection with what you say about marriage and women writing, there's a little episode I'd like to share with you, not about myself, but which is very revealing about why women write as they do, or perhaps stop writing. Some years ago, I was in London for a literary meeting, and I met a woman writer from Sri Lanka. And she said to me, we were having a cup of coffee together, and she said to me, can I please have a chat with you about a personal problem? And I said, yes. So she said she'd written a novel, and in this novel, a married woman falls in love with another man, and she goes away with her lover. That's the ending. Well, her husband read that novel, and he was in a rage. He said to her, if you end your book like this, our marriage is finished. Now, there was nothing wrong with her marriage. She loved her husband, she loved her children. He said, our marriage will end if you end your book like this. One was fiction, the other was fact. The husband had confused the two, or perhaps he couldn't conceive that a virtuous woman would write an ending like this. And what would people think? And she changed the ending. And these are the constraints upon women writing, which I think women have felt in every country. In my case, I too was under restraints of this kind, self-restraints, because there was always the question of, if he reads this, what is he going to think? So it took me time to come out of that shell, and I think as I did come out of it gradually and became a little braver as I went on, my heroines became braver as a result of that. So these are the kind of changes that take place in writing, and some of the reasons why they do.
But do you think this is mainly because for centuries we have lived, for the better or the worse, in a male-centric society where possession, as we were talking about yesterday, we talked about land and the zamindari system.
Yes. No, in my case, my problem was that I had come out of a family where the men were feminists. My father and my uncle were feminists. My father had marched in a suffragette procession in London. That's how committed they were to equality. So I believed that the world is like this. When the atmosphere in your own home is free and you are treated as an equal, and even as children, we were consulted about our lives, what we would wish to do, and so on. I thought that the whole world is like this, which was very naive, but there it is. And it came to me as a shock that the world outside my home was very different, that men did not all believe in equality, yes. And a lot of problems arose out of that situation.
But also, you were very young when you married, and but before that, who were the women in your family or others who influenced you and your thoughts and your thinking when you were growing up? Was it your grandmother? You talk about Sarojini Naidu in the book, other writers who were there. Who were these women who shaped your thought, your thinking?
The women never did shape anything to do with my life or my writing. It was two men who shaped my life and my writing. One was Jawaharlal Nehru, my uncle, and the other was Ranjit Pandit, my father. And these were the two men to whom I owe all that I may have achieved and to my ideas and my values and everything that I have fought for. And there was plenty to fight for in my personal as well as my political engagements. And it is these two men who are responsible.
Ritu, when Nayantara ji talks about political engagement, which you've also talked about in the book, at the time when much had happened in her personal life, and then she came back and she started writing columns on Mrs. Gandhi, took on, and that whole, being the voice, telling you to not kind of toe the line as far as she was. How did you weave that in with the books again that she had written?
Well, there was a period when I think the journalistic writing, the political column,
yes,
she was, of course, the first woman political columnist in English, and we tend not to remember this and to acknowledge it, because of course we are not used to crediting women with being the first in anything, let alone in journalism, which to this day remains so male dominated and so male obsessed, I would say. I don't mean just the figure of the man, but in the priorities, in how you report, in what you think is important, in an obsession with power and politics, and so on. Anyway, but she was the first woman political columnist, and it also coincided with a transition in her personal life. The political writing, in a sense, the sustained political writing, not the odd column that she was writing for a long time, but the sustained, regular, fortnightly column in the Indian Express coincided with the transition in her personal life. Now, it so happened that transition in her personal life coincided with the transition in Indira Gandhi's political life, which is the split in the Congress in 1969. Now, how was it not possible to, and also there was a sort of lull in the fiction writing for a short period, but nevertheless there was a lull. So it seemed to me that this was another of those critical moments when the writing, the political engagement, and the transition in her personal life coincided in a way that obviously, as a biographer, I have to address. I can't actually. The problem really is that I can't privilege one over the other. That was the challenge. The challenge was, just as, let's say, a very big challenge was not to have Nayantara overwhelmed by the Nehrus. That is, by Jawaharlal Nehru, her own parents, and Mrs. Gandhi. I mean, how in this very high-profile, highly political family do I keep the spotlight on her and not allow it to sort of become a family portrait? I mean, I'm not interested in a family portrait. On the other hand, I can't discount that. So, the challenge was to see what are the intersections in a life that allow you to read it. So I'm reading the life, not just the books.
But also, Nayantara ji, when you cross swords, as it were, with your cousin and said it the way it needed to be said, was there any resistance at that time from fellow journalists, writers, columnists saying that why are you doing this? Why are you tarnishing the name of your family? And what is this battle all about? Why can't you, take it easy?
Let me say that my battle, as Ritu was saying, was on many fronts. The chief battle was on the economic front. My divorce had impoverished me. And she's talking about my starting writing political commentary, which at that time earned 250 rupees per column, which was not a princely sum. And I was trying to scrape together a living in very difficult circumstances, along with the fact that I was living in what is known as sin in Delhi, the capital of India, when my cousin was Prime Minister. All of these things were, well, sort of difficult to live with. But I had to, let me give the credit to my upbringing and not to myself, that I then vigorously opposed some of Mrs. Gandhi's policies, never on a personal level. She and I had been extremely close. I had been her favorite young cousin. She had loved me dearly and looked after me as a child, and it was terribly hard for me to have any kind of break with her, but I saw no option because I couldn't go along with the rising authoritarianism. That was the path she was on at the time. So, it was difficult. And I think the only reason that I could do it is because I felt there was nothing else that I should do. I don't think it's a matter of courage, not at all. When you have a conviction that this is what I should do, you simply do it, There's no other way that you can respond. And so I went ahead, and when people, as some people did say, as you were saying, how can you oppose your family? My reply to that was, I am defending my family. It is Indira Gandhi who is opposing what her family stands for. I am defending the values of Nehru. And of course, that had not occurred to my critics.
And these values that you talk about, these values that you were defending, do you think that it was too much an idealistic situation, and what has happened to the country today as you see it, all that is fading away very fast? How do you respond to this? Because you were so passionately wanting to defend something which was so close to your heart.
No, not so close to my heart. It was a matter of what India stood for, not a personal thing about being close to my heart. What was being destroyed at that time was democracy and all the ideals laid down by our constitution. So it was not a personal thing. But what was the first part of your question?
I said that when you see the
change.
The change.
Yeah. Well, any struggle for freedom in India or anywhere else brings out the best and the noblest in human character, anywhere. It's always happened. I mean, take America, for example. In the time of George Washington, the legend about him is that George Washington could not tell a lie. Well, that's certainly not been the case with George Bush. Times change, ideals fade, power corrupts, and all that, nobility is not there to be seen anymore, and that is exactly what has happened in India. It's nothing to be surprised about. There has been an increasing decline in the kind of values that the freedom movement supported. And I have to say I'm a little grateful for the increasing corruption, because I would have had no material for my novels had things been going wonderfully well.
But we've talked about very serious things. We've talked about, as a young woman growing up, I mean, and much of it was spent away from parents, in schools, then in college in America. What did you do as a teenager? What were the kind of things that you people enjoyed doing? Did you like going to the movies? Did you like listening to music? What was the kind of music that you listened to? The growing up years. It could all have been political, and
I have to say that I'm not a happy person, basically. I was a sad child. I know that when we were taken to the photographer for pictures to be taken for some reason, and the photographer would say, "Smile," and then my mother would say to him, don't ask her to smile. She never smiles. She's a solemn child, so let her be that way. No, I was not one of these cheerful children. And I remember that in Wellesley, in my freshman year, there was a girl opposite me with whom I became great friends. And she said, you know, when I met you, I wrote down in my diary, there's a girl with very sad eyes who lives across the corridor from me. So that must have conveyed itself to other people. I think that my childhood left me with certain scars of that kind. But that was not, the end of the story. In our family, there was a lot of laughter. We had learned to laugh at difficult situations. We had been told, don't cry in front of the police when they come to arrest my father or mother. But because children do cry, I had to go into the bathroom afterwards and cry. But not where anybody could see me cry. So we were brought up with that strict sort of discipline which has never abandoned me, which has stood by me all my life, and I'm grateful for it. But for the happy side of it, music, my father loved music. He was a Maharashtrian, yeah. I'm only half Kashmiri, who sang us little Marathi folk songs. He also enjoyed jazz, all the latest, songs from movies that were coming out then. He loved Indian classical music. So we had a wide variety of music to listen to and take part in. And as a child, I also played the violin. He was so keen on music, he also wanted my voice trained. And for many years, I had a singing teacher. But all of that could not sort of continue to its logical conclusion because of the jail going and because he died of his last imprisonment.
And also the turmoil that was happening at that time.
The turmoil, true. So, but as I say, there was a lot of laughter. Much of it was caused by visitors like the great Sarojini Naidu, who used to come to visit Anand Bhavan, and she was a very amusing person, a very, very unserious and very irreverent. I remember she told us a story once about a man who had been traveling with her in a train, and she said to him, would you ever travel by plane? Would you like to travel by plane? And the man said to her, no, 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 no. He said, if you travel by train and you have an accident, there you are. If you travel by plane and you have an accident, there you are. So that kind of story she used to tell. And she was highly irreverent about Gandhiji. She called him a chocolate-colored Mickey Mouse. And so it was fun, people like her coming and going in the house, and there were a great many. I didn't know how important they were at the time, but they were the people who were then meeting in the library at Anand Bhavan to work out Congress policies and that kind of thing. And they were full of laughter. After discussing their serious matters, they'd all come down and eat with a hearty appetite when there really wasn't enough food to go around because they hadn't been expected to stop for lunch. So that kind of thing, was always happening.
But also, did you read a lot? Did you spend a lot of time with books?
I did, because we had a big library, and my uncle from jail used to write to me and point out to me, on X shelf you'll find this book, you'll enjoy it. One book he recommended was Ariel by Andre Morwa, which was a biography of Shelley. And another was Don Quixote, which he thought I would enjoy. And history, sometime. Then he would say, if I asked him, what do you think of so-and-so, he'd say, look up my glimpses of world history. I've, written it all down there, so read that. So books were like constant companions. And that was a habit that myself and my two sisters developed in childhood and which have served us very well.
Ritu, a life so richly lived through so much of our own historical realities of the country. How hard was it for you to leave things out, weave things in? What did you find? How long did it take you to write this, your first draft, and then chop and change and know what you wanted to keep and what you wanted to throw out?
Well, Nayantara may or may not believe this, but I've left out about 80% of the personal. At least 80. There are 2 more books there if I were to dwell on the personal. It's a difficult decision, and you have to tread, especially, I have to say this, the problem for a lot of biographers is having a very slender archive. What are your sources that are unassailable? And that's why I distrust hugely an anecdotal biography, because to me that has no ring of anything except one person's account. In Nayantara's case, it's a huge archive, huge, not just hers, but the whole family, the whole country. The photography archive is enormous. And as an extraordinary gesture and an extraordinarily gracious gesture, everything was available to me. Now, the decision then is, how should I put it? The responsibility then is enormous. Because obviously, if someone has entrusted all their material, and as I say, enormous amount of personal stuff there, I haven't even touched upon her relationship with her mother, for example. She speaks about the men in her family. My goodness, there's a whole subtext of the women there, which I avoided. I didn't. There's a huge subtext about several other relationships that are absolutely not in the book, and the decision for that was, if it had nothing to do with her writing, I was not going to go there. If it did not speak to her as a writer, it was not my business to go there. Even though that may well have been a valid decision to make. So, as I say, it had to be a very delicate balance between these things, between the personal, the political, and the literary, and where it was unavoidable that the literary had to be enmeshed with the personal is where the personal enters the story. But as I say, there are at least 2 other books there because of the richness of the archive.
I hope you're not planning to write them.
No, not at all. Rest assured, not at all.
But as a biography, perhaps a little more on, as you said, the relationships with the other women in the family would have, because in the novels there are other women characters who were representative of family members. So.
Well, where they were, sorry to interrupt, but where they were representative family members, they are there. So her mother is there in a situation in New Delhi.
But very briefly, you skimmed on.
Because after all, as she says, it's fiction. You can't stretch it so far as to make fact and fiction one. You see, you can't, at least I didn't think that I should be doing that.
No, what you have done with the men is that where fiction ended, then you have gone into the relationships there and, talked about the personal life. Here you tended to not do it. So why did you do that?
As I said, the one relationship that I would have explored much further is the relationship with her mother, which I think in my reading of it of what she said and of the way the way her political engagement evolved. I think there was a fairly strong relationship with the mother, who continued in politics. After all, the father didn't live for that long. What he would have done, we don't know. But Vijayalakshmi Pandit certainly did enter politics. She was politically active for quite a long time, and certainly I feel that was a meeting ground for them. I mean, there were reasons why I didn't explore that too much, primarily because I couldn't meet Mrs. Pandit. And I didn't think that it was something I could do honestly and fully without being able to talk to her. Which is, I suppose, maybe was timid of me, I don't know. But I think that all I had was a scope of happiness.
And letters, I'm sure.
Some personal letters. There were but personal letters between Mrs. Pandit and Nayantara were entirely familial. Some were political, some when she was fighting the elections. I did talk to her sister, who was still alive, but not the one who had passed away, obviously. So there were certain constraints there, which as I said, I was not interested in just impressionistic memories by people. If I didn't have something I could, something solid I could trust, I decided I would just leave it.
But Nayantara, what was your relationship with your mother? Was it very volatile? Did you look up to her in many ways? Were there confrontations ever? Because she herself was such a strong personality.
She was a wonderful mother in every way. But I do have to emphasize that my close relationship was with my father. But as my mother was concerned, she grew to trust my political judgment, so that when I came out against the emergency, she came out and she made a statement which was published abroad also, saying that democratic rights were being destroyed and so on. And by that time I was completely involved in J.P. Narayan's movement in Bihar, and she gave me all possible support, just as she had stood by me very strongly in my personal life, which had become extremely unconventional, and for her perhaps somewhat embarrassing. And yet she stood by me through all that, and I could always count on her for her support. In fact, I now live in the house which she left to me in Dehradun.
Why didn't you enter politics? You commented on it, you've written about it. Didn't you feel that there was a time when you also wanted to get into the thick of it?
I entered politics very heavily through my fiction.
Yes.
That was my entry into politics, because politics was my natural material. I had known nothing else since childhood. You know, writer doesn't choose her material.
The material chooses.
Yes. So that was the material I had. And in fact, I once, when I came home from college, asked my uncle, should I enter the Congress party? So he said, if you want to. But he said, why bother? You want to be a writer? Why not get on with that? That was his advice.
Yes.
At
But
one
don't
time,
say that you didn't choose. You did choose to
well,
write.
no, there was no need to make a choice, as it were.
That way. Okay.
Even at that time, I remember in Dr. Radhakrishnan's time, when he was president, and he was telling my mother she must enter politics. Tell her now to stop looking after her children and enter politics. Nobody could ever persuade me to do that. Yeah.
I know that the only time when you came near enough was when the ambassadorship was offered to you by Morarji Bhai to go to Italy, I think, and then the government collapsed.
Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was then External Affairs Minister. Well, I don't know why he wanted to send me as an ambassador. I had no such ambition. In fact, I'll tell you how it happened. I was living in Delhi at the time, and one day the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So, अच्छा नयनतारा जी आप क्या लिख रही हैं आजकल? तो मैंने कहा कि कुछ ख़ास नहीं अटल जी, मैं अपने आर्टिकल्स लिख रही हूँ. लिखिए लिखिए, आगे आपको बहुत समय नहीं मिलेगा लिखने के लिए. तो मैंने कहा क्यों? क्योंकि हम आपको बाहर भेजना चाहते हैं. I said, अटल जी मुझे बाहर मत भेजिए, मुझे कोई इच्छा नहीं है बाहर जाने की, मेरा काम यहाँ है. नहीं नहीं आपको जाना पड़ेगा and all that. And so he appointed me ambassador to Italy. And then of course the Janata government fell in the election, next election, and Mrs. Gandhi came back to power and cancelled my name. So luckily I didn't have to go to Italy.
But, wrapping up the session today, because I think we've finished. Nayantara, the entire question of intolerance that has raised its voice suddenly in India today, there was intolerance right throughout. I mean, the independence movement time, when there was intolerance from the British towards the Indians, when there was intolerance within caste communities. This sudden flaring up has happened because it has had political sanction, perhaps. And
that's right. Yes.
And how would you, respond to it, comment on it?
Well, my response has been extremely vigorous. As you know, perhaps I returned my Sahitya Akademi Award because of the murder of Kalburgi and the two rationalist writers before him. And I did that because I was outraged by the silence of the Sahitya Akademi over the murder of these writers. And as you know, huge protests developed in the country which extended far beyond writers to scientists, historians, and people in every discipline, actors, filmmakers, who now all feel threatened, not by what I would call intolerance, because I don't call murder intolerance, it's a crime. The crime of these attacks on the right to dissent, that is being wiped out by our ruling Hindutva ideology. Writers are under death threats, people are having their faces painted black, films are being stopped, you name it. Every kind of enormity is going on because the people who commit these enormities and atrocities have the protection of the people in power. And it is Hindutva ideology to not permit disagreement. So I'm very much involved in that situation today, as many, many of my fellow writers are, and as many other people in many disciplines are. And that fight is on.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, Ritu and Nayantara ji. It was stimulating, and I hope that you will win the fight at some point of time. For all
I will,
idealists.
have no fear. I will.
Thank you very much, Jayabrato. Thank you.